Welcome to the Origin Story, an Eko-Podcast series brought to you by the Goethe-Zentrum Hyderabad and EkoGalaxy, in collaboration with Roundglass Sustain. The Origin Story is created in the hope that we live in and leave a planet that is more just, more joyful, and more diverse across lands, oceans, and species. We bring conversations with giants in the field, those who've walked the uncharted path and done right by the beautiful biodiversity of our shared planet. What were their early connections to the natural world? How did they come to be the person they are today? And what are some of the lessons for the rest of us towards building a better world? In this episode, we bring you the delightful and inspiring naturalist Kobita Kolli in conversation with the brilliant and the wisest tree of them all, Pradip Krishen. And once again, thank you for your interest in our planet, biodiversity, and closely interlinked our own well-being. Thank you for listening.
Hello, I'm Kobita. I'm a naturalist based in Hyderabad, Telangana. I document the native flora and small fauna with a focus on the flora of the rocky outcrops and their ecology. I share my findings on walks, talks, and social media. I'm very pleased to introduce our wonderful guest who is remarkable for the many hats he wears. He has been a teacher of history at Delhi University, a multi-award-winning scriptwriter, director, and filmmaker. He is a father, Arundhati Roy's spouse, a writer, and author of 2 comprehensive field guides on trees, is a tree spotter and walker, and is India's eminent ecological restoration practitioner. The term that best describes him will be multi-potentialite. Although not the best sounding, it's very apt. For instance, among his many interests is a delightful flair for art, design, and limericks. You may have guessed it's none other than the extraordinary and multifaceted Pradip Krishen. Welcome, Pradip. I'm so happy to be doing this session with you.
Thank you, Kobita. That's very kind of you, but I feel over-described, over-credited with all kinds of facets that I don't necessarily have. But let's not get into that. Go ahead.
So we know you as the very accomplished Pradip Krishen. With this being the origin story, we are curious to know the young Pradip, the teenager and young adult. What were your interests and beliefs then? Who and what influenced you and shaped you into who you are today?
When I think back of what I was like in school and later in college at Delhi University, I was a very straight guy in the sense that I think I was headed for the civil services exam to become a IAS person or an IFS person. I think that's where I was headed, possibly because that's what my father was in the ICS. And it wasn't until I finished college in Delhi and went to Oxford that I kind of turned around completely. There was a huge sea change in the kind of person that I was and the kind of aspiration that I had. But if you want me to relate this to being interested in nature and being interested in, in things that have to do with the jungle and restoration and all of that, all I can really recall is feeling completely at home when I was in a place of wilderness. My father was posted in Nairobi, in what was then East Africa, in the 1950s. And he had a huge beat. He toured not just Kenya and what was then Tanganyika, Uganda, Rwanda, Urundi, Nyasaland, the Belgian Congo. And when he toured, he would often take his family along. So I remember lots and lots of times when I was in the African veldt, in the African bush, and just loving it. I just felt as if this was perfection. But beyond that, one interesting fact is that when I went to boarding school at the age of 11, the first holiday project I did was on the wildlife of Africa. Putting together a little book and cutting out pictures and pasting them in there and talking about the gazelles and their distribution, things like that, at the age of 11. So there must have been an interest then. Then lay suppressed for a long time. But what I also remember very clearly is that when I came back from England after going to college there, I was introduced very early to Dr. Salim Ali's The Book of Indian Birds. I took to it, I enjoyed it a lot, I carried it wherever I went. But I remember thinking, what a wonderful thing to do, for a country, to be able to write a field guide that would give so many other people so much pleasure, and little did I think that one day I might write a field guide of my own, but on a much smaller scale than Salim Ali's. But I guess that's when I started traveling to wild places. I had friends. I had one set of friends who were photographers and filmmakers, and they concentrated on wildlife. A few other people who traveled a lot into wild places. I would visit places. I went to Manas, in the northeast. I went to Corbett, and I went to the wild areas around Dehradun, and I started just loving it. For me, that was just perfection. The big wildlife event or set of events that I think marked me very clearly was being invited to film Billy Arjan Singh wanting to reunite with Tara, the tigress that he had reintroduced into the wild around 1985-86. I met Billy Arjan Singh by accident because a friend of mine was traveling with 5 rhinos that had been brought from Kaziranga and were being translocated to Dudwa. And he asked me to be on the tarmac filming one of these giant Russian AN-12 planes landing. And he hoped that what would happen was that the big bay doors would open at the back and these rhinos would roll out, one to each wooden crate. But it didn't actually happen like that. But I was there on the tarmac and waiting to film this because my friend was actually on the plane. There would have been time for him to get off and shoot this. Then he said, "Do you want to come to Dudwa with the rhinos and watch the relocation?" And I said, "I'd love to." So me and Arundhati traveled with him to Dudwa, and we met Billy Arjan Singh for the first time. And then we traveled again a few months later when another batch of rhinos was being captured and released from Nepal. And Billy happened to say that, "Look, I intend to reestablish a relationship with Tara." And all of us had read Billy's books by then, after the first time I met him. And the accepted story was that Tara had been shot as a man-eater by a man that Billy regarded as his archenemy in the forest department. And we said, "Billy, but is Tara alive?" And he said, "Yes, she's very much alive." And we said, "Well, what about the fact that R.L. Singh said he'd shot Tara and then you had behaved as if you'd lost a daughter?" He said, "Yeah, I was just putting on a show. I wanted him to believe that he shot Tara, but Tara had a Y-shaped catapult mark on her left cheek, and the tigress that R.L. Singh had shot didn't. I just wanted him to keep away from Tara, so I pretended that, I had lost my beloved." So he said, "So she's been alive. She's had 3 litters. I provide bait for her when she's just had her cubs. And I intend to call out to her and have her roll at my feet and be the daughter that she was for me." We said, "Yeah." He basically asked my friend, who was a wildlife cinematographer, he said, "Can you come and shoot it?" And he said, "Look, I can't because I have an assignment that I have to finish in May. But my friend Pradip is also can wield the camera. Why don't you ask him?" And I said, "Look, I don't have any jungle craft. I can certainly use a 16mm movie camera." He said, "Well, you don't need the jungle craft. You've got me. So just come." So Arundhati and me were getting ready to come to Dudwa with a 16mm Ariflex camera and an assistant in May of 1985, I think it was. We arrived there, and before we got there, somebody called Hashim Taibji called and said, "Pradip, I need to talk to you." And we said, "Yes, what about?" And he said, "Well, it's about your trip to Billy's place." We said, "Sure, come over." So Hashim said, "Look, there's 2 things I need to tell you about. One is that if you've been reading Billy's books, they're ghost written. He doesn't write them himself. So any sense of humor that comes across, this genial, wonderful, clever man, he may be clever, but he's a grump. Billy is not the Billy that you think, that you get from the books." And the other thing he told us was, he said, "Look, the greatest authority on wild tigers in South Asia is a man called Chuck McDougall, who's working in Nepal. Whether R.L. Singh shot Tara or not, he doesn't know. But the tigress that Billy now claims is Tara is certainly not Tara." So we said, all right, so now we're headed to be with Billy Arjun Singh, where he's not the person we think he is, and the tigress is not the tigress that we think, or that he claims it is. We had a pretty disastrous shoot because Billy became very grumpy, very difficult to deal with. We saw tigers and tigresses. I was on a ground machan on this lovely tea-colored river, and I would spend about 11 hours a day in the machan. So I saw tigers coming to the edge of the river and drinking, sometimes for 3 or 4 minutes, which seemed like an eternal amount of time, swimming across and then disappearing. And then they'd come back 8 hours later. So I didn't really have any footage of tiger behavior. I had tigers drinking water, I had tigers at a kill. And then finally Billy said, okay, Pradip, today I'm going to call out to Tara. So be ready to film it. And I said, finally, this is, the denouement of the whole trip. So he looked at me, said, okay, now start. So I pressed the camera button, and he sort of raised his chin and he went, Tara, 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 and all the veins stuck out on his neck. And nothing happened. And I'm still filming. I've got both my eyes open now because one eye is trying to gauge what's happening, outside the camera. And then he says, okay, now cut it. So I cut it. And I said, well, what about Tara? And he says, well, I have to do that in a separate shot. So I said, Billy, that is what is regarded as a cheated shot in cinema. You don't do a cut. And he thought I was calling him a cheat, so he got even more grumpy. And to cut a long story short, the shoot itself was disaster. We got nothing meaningful. But my God, I spent those 13 days in the jungle in May in this crushing heat and humidity, and just completely, the jungle soaked itself into me, and I just loved it. I loved it. So there was a stork-billed kingfisher that would be calling all day long on the river, and just the sounds and the smells of the jungle was, they floated into me. But in 1994, when I decided for complicated reasons that I wasn't going to make films anymore, and I walked away, I actually had no idea what I was going to do next. And I didn't look back over my shoulder to even entertain the thought of making films again. By this time, I had bought a tiny plot of land in a little village outside Patsmari. And while we were building a house, me and my architect friend, we just completely fell in love with the wild. We would walk every day, sometimes for 2 hours, sometimes for 3 hours. And slowly, you build up a kind of relationship, not just with what you're seeing, but you're also getting a sense of the totality of it, the ecology of it, And I was lucky to have a forester neighbor, and we bought pieces of land together next to each other. And he started teaching us what he knew. And he would say, Pradip, is peड़ ka naam jante ho? And I'd say, nahi, Nishi, batao. And he said that this is called Rohan, Soimira febrifuga. So we started doing what we called Latin walks, where he would tell us the Latin names, he'd tell us the local name. And my architect friend and me said to each other, we said, look, this is great fun. Why don't we see if we can learn to identify all the trees in this forest? 1.5 or 2 years it's going to take us to build a house because we're going to spend a lot of time here. And we said, yeah, let's do that. So I bought my first Flora, which was a book by Dietrich Brandis written in the 1880s about this region in a wider way. And I remember the first thing I did was I took a little blue felt pen and I marked only those plants that were trees, because I thought that if I try and understand more than a limited amount, it would just take me too long. So I only looked at the trees. So the blue dots directed my attention to only the trees in the flora. Of course, the language was unfamiliar. I had to use a glossary a lot, but that's what appreciated me. And Nishi taught us that it's not just about recognizing what a tree looks like, but it's also what the bark feels like, what the leaves taste like, and so on. All of this time, it was a bit like bird watching. I was tree spotting. It was no more than a hobby. I never imagined for a minute that it would be anything more than just fun. But you were reading a part of the book of nature and having fun. By this time, I, in a sense, limped back to Delhi, having nothing to show for the previous 4 years of my life, except having built a house. And I thought, oh my God, this is not good, And I looked out across from my front gate in Delhi, and there was a tree growing there. And I said, my God, I've lived with this tree for 18 years and I have no idea what it is. So why don't I use my hobby and make a little guide to the 20 or 30 most common trees of Delhi? Because nobody seems to know anything about trees. The lowest common denominator of awareness was so low. And I thought if nothing else, I just photocopy my 30-page field guide and give it to friends. So that's really how the tree thing started. It's important to realize that I'm not trained. I'm not a botanist. I'm not a scientist.
But having said that, you developed this skill in the science, and perhaps it was difficult, like you had mentioned briefly. What were your resources? I mean, did you reach out to people to help, to understand, to quote you from jungle trees, turn a dry as dust scientific flora into something so easily understood by common people?
Yeah, I mean, you have to understand that when I did my first book, The Trees of Delhi, I started working on it in 1998. And the net wasn't half as great then as it is now as a resource, but it was still useful in some ways. I found some great libraries in Delhi. For example, I don't know whether you know of a publication called The Wealth of India. There was a man called George Watt who wrote a 10-volume book. It's something like an encyclopedia of the natural wealth of India, something like that, in the 1880s. And he did it for the Great London Exhibition of 1888 or whatever the year was. And it was just an amazing book. So every plant you can think of that had an economic use that was talked about by local people. Also minerals, birds, animals. I mean, there's 270 pages on Indian silks, for example, and all the different kinds. I mean, it's just an amazing, amazing work, still useful. When Nehru became prime minister, he was somehow aware of George Watt's books. And he said, we should update this. We should, knowing what we know and with our modern sort of chemistry and scientific tools, let's update George Watt's book and create something called The Wealth of India. They would start with A, and they got as far as CI, I think. And this was already 6 volumes. And then they thought, let's just do this digitally because it's going to be too long otherwise. And it never finished. But they had a great library. And I would spend days there sneezing away because there was so much dust. But just amazing collection of botanical magazines and information. So I was being like a magpie. I was just collecting whatever I could. There were lots of things that puzzled me. But my daughters were in school in Dehradun. And whenever I went there, I would spend time in the FRI. I would spend time in their botanical garden. I made friends with a wonderful botanist called Nathani, and he would show me things. Yeah, I was just using whatever resource I could lay my hands on, mostly written, but I was determined. By the time the ambition grew, it was about writing about every tree I found in the city, even if it was a one-off, in someone's garden. And I might have missed a few, but I spent 6 years making the book, Kobita. So
that's amazing.
I mean, 6 years and I had the luxury of being able to do this because Arundhati by this time had become a big writer. I didn't have to keep the wolf from the door running across.
That's wonderful. So through this book, The Field Guide to Trees of Delhi, which was out in 2006, it's so much about appreciation for the tree, which earlier, there were the tree books which were just, sort of factual with a little sketchy drawing. But, these photographs, there was so much clarity, had an aesthetic appeal, and your conversational style of writing, it was refreshing, to say the least, and very engaging. And then, of course, the language, you made it so much simpler that the baffling aspects of botany one forgot about. Well, you did say that transformative experiences in the natural world, one of which was all these little forays you had into, the jungle. But in Delhi as well, the book, you have shown context. What I really liked was in the introduction to the book, you had historical and a little ecological perspective. And I'd never come across that before. We never did in, these kind of books. And I found that was such a wonderful setting. And now it seems like, you can't do without that kind of an introduction to kind of a book. So how did you plan this kind of a layout, the kind of context in which you put the book. And then, of course, what in Delhi sparked I think you walked in the ridge for so many years,
I
for
walked
decades, I think.
I walked a lot. I walked not just on the ridge, but all over. But I did public walks. And I found that public walks taught me a lot because it taught me what people were confused by, what they wanted to know. I was able to direct, I could see their gaze, right? So I was doing public walks on holidays. And I mean, when I say public walks, maybe 10 a year. So not frenetically, but each of those walks taught me something. And you have to remember that I myself had so recently been an unschooled person in terms of, trees and plants. But it was easy to remember that I wanted to write for somebody who'd been like me. I wanted to write in a way that didn't need decoding and didn't need running for glossary, And so the combination of walks and myself having taught myself, this stuff was what worked. But somebody wrote an article about me in Caravan around 2011 or something. And I've sometimes thought of myself as being a bit of a jackrabbit and hopping out for something else and hopping here and then doing something different. She was the first person to actually point out to me that I've actually led one from another and that they're all connected. And that what I'm doing now uses all the muscles that I've accumulated over the past. So as a filmmaker and a visual person, I'm using that skill as, in my photography. As a historian and a researcher, I know how to go to an archive and look at historical material and put it together and look at how a city works. And then the writing. I love writing. Writing doesn't come easily to me. I do a lot of revising and a lot of kata piti, but I love the act of creating words, sentences that go well together. I think with Trees of Delhi, the most important thing for me was to tell stories that were accessible to everyone. And nearly all the feedback that I've got, and a lot of people wrote to me because I put my email at the back, they said, my God, it's so lovely because now we can go out with your book. And the world suddenly made more sense to them with the book, which was great.
And even the jungle trees of central India, I'd just like to mention how easy it is to, use. If Trees of Delhi set a benchmark for field guides in the botanical realm, at least over here in India, that's as far as I know, you raise that by several notches when it came to Jungle Trees of Central India, which is published in 2013. I have observed in the recent time I spent with you, I've observed novices in tree spotting become so fluent with the use of the book within an hour or so. And that joy of identifying is so amazing to see. And so the book makes it really fun being a plant detective. So it's fun to go out, with the book, both the books, in fact, and do our own tree spotting. Let me just mention your work at Ecological Restoration. You've done a unique and very successful project in Jodhpur, creating Rao Jodha Desert Rock Park. I found it fascinating to learn how it came about from, preparing the ground, uprooting the mesquite, trials of planting native plants to suit the specific substrates. And then Kishanbag Roi in Jaipur is another brilliantly conceived and executed project in ecological restoration, where you're showcasing the native flora of the desert dunes. During this, you faced, of course, several challenges. Some were, of course, exciting. There were terrible disappointments as well. Could you tell us a little bit about the joys and rewards of these two projects, and just a little bit about what it is all about, ecological restoration?
With Jodhpur, there's a very clear sense in which when I started working on trying to restore the park, I didn't have any deep knowledge of the flora of the desert, no experience of working in that kind of ecology at all. And looking back, it's pretty miraculous that they asked me to come there and do it. But what I had was a lot of curiosity, an ability to be very focused and to take lots of observations and notes. and to use a lot of common sense. I mean, the first difficult thing we had to do was to get rid of the mesquite, the vilaiti kikar, which was everywhere. It was rampant throughout the 170 acres of the park, which was rocky ground. And everybody told us that, look, it's really hard to get rid of mesquite because you can't just cut it down. It just coppices and regrows. And we started asking local people whether they had any experience of getting rid of, they call it bavlia. Bavlia is the local name for Prosopis juliflora. And we got some very cockeyed ideas, superstitions. On a full moon night, put fresh gobar on a cut stump and it won't grow back again. Use this mantra and it, so on and so forth. We had discovered from the net that Bavlia has, in its root zone, it has buds that will regrow, but those buds only go down about 2 feet below the surface of the soil. So if you can get to 2 feet or below 2 feet, then it doesn't coppice. So that was the blow up all these rocky hills because they are part of the heritage landscape of the fort. And they said, no, we don't mean that you should use a big charge. You just use a tiny 1/100th of the normal charge. And we said, show it to us. And they said, yeah, but because you want to go down 2 feet, we have to use some charge. And they blew up one tiny hill. And we said, no, this is no good. And finally, we met a group of traditional miners from this region who are extremely adept at working in rock. And we didn't think it would work because the rock that is used for construction and for every other purpose in Jodhpur is a sandstone, which is soft and very amenable when you take a chisel to it. But this was rhyolite, which is a brittle volcanic rock, much harder, as hard as granite. And we didn't think that they would have any experience of working with this rock. So we met not a young man, we met a middle-aged man called Dhan Singh, who was the leader of this community called the Khandwalias, who are the traditional miners. And Dhan Singh we said to Dhan Singh, we took him to a 4-foot-high Bavlia bush and we said, can you go down 2 feet below the ground? And he said, haan ji, kar lenge. So we thought, all right, show us. So he sat down on his haunches and he tapped the ground lightly with his hammer. They use very heavy hammers. And then he turned his face to one side and he hit the ground hard 3 times. And we thought he was averting his eyes because he didn't want shards of rock to go in, to strike him in the face. But it's only later we realized that he was actually listening to the sound of his hammer on the rock. And that sound gave him all the information that he needed to understand how that rock was, kahan se bhara hai, kahan se pola hai, that sort of stuff, And we came back a few hours later and he was pulling out these flat ribbon roots from between rock. And he showed us that it was possible to do. It was going to be painstaking, but he could do it. So we eventually hired 15 Khandwalias who worked through the year for 7 years, getting rid of the thousands and thousands of Bavlia bushes and trees that we had on the land. And we were following in their wake. So we would clear 2 or 3 hectares and we would plant up 2 or 3 hectares.
Nice.
And the plan we made was that wherever Bavlia had been taken out of and a pit had been created, that pit was going to become a pit that would contain a new plant because Bavlia had already done the work of identifying where it was possible for a plant to grow in that really hostile environment. And we started to bring in plants from the desert. We were only looking at plants that grow in rock because plants that grow in sand have a very different ecology and a different set of factors that allow them to grow there. And in our first year, after we'd planted them and we waited a few months, we were getting 60-65% success rates, survival rates of the plants. And we didn't quite understand why. And we knew we wanted to find out why. So we then labeled every single pit, gave it a number, measured the depth of each pit. We were experimenting with different kinds of soil mixes for the planting. We recorded the species of plant that was being planted. We recorded the site quality, whether it was at the bottom of a little tekra, whether it was somewhere in the middle, whether it was in a crack in the rock, and so on. And we started to get not 100%, but a lot of clarity about what the plants needed and what kind of places they were comfortable growing in. So suddenly we began to read the rocky terrain in a way that we were not able to do in the beginning. And that's what really allowed us to plant it up well. And then there were lots of little things, but we had to learn how to grow. Some of the plants were recalcitrant. So we had a very clever plant nurseryman called Vinod, who was just very good at remembering what he'd done in the past, not repeating the same mistakes, learning from his mistakes, doing great things. So the nursery work went really well. It took us, I think, 3 years to feel that, okay, now we knew enough about what grows where and how. We brought in something like 70 species of grasses and we were shocked there were that many kinds of grasses that will grow in rock. A lot of the plants in Rajodha Park are annuals, so they live short lives, rushing through their lives only when there's moisture in the ground, from the monsoon till about October, November, December. So we got an amazing amount of support from the trust, the Meranga Museum Trust that runs the fort. And I hope we made them really proud because it's come out really well. The visitor center was a great job of designing and making it work. We have trained naturalists now who started as, really kind of wet under the gills, if that's the right term. But they've become really, really quite interested in what they're doing. And we have now publications on our website and all that. I mean, Rajodha Park has been unqualified joy and success, I think. I stopped working there in 2021. I retired, but I continue to go there quite often. And I've trained a young person called Somil, who works there now as director, and he's doing a wonderful job. And we continue to do things like botanical art workshops every August, and a pretty full calendar of stuff that keeps us out of mischief.
I just wanted to also ask you whether there's any takeaways, some lessons from the disappointments in the process of restoration.
Well, my biggest disappointment as a restoration practitioner is not having had the opportunity to work with local people who live and work in a particular ecology, in a particular environment. I would have loved, I think it would be very difficult to make it work where they are actually empowered to take decisions about their own, ecology. It would be very tricky and very interesting, I think. And my computer is filled with projects that were proposed and never happened. I would have loved to work in a regime such as a regime that a forest department might have sort of said, okay, we'll put this aside. Here's 100 hectares. There's 2 villages in there. Work with them and see whether you can come up with a model where those people are actually deciding what happens and then make a restoration system work. But I've never had that opportunity. I came close because way back in 2012, I proposed that we find a Pagdandi pathway in the mountains at about 7,000 or 8,000 feet up, which is a very, very beautiful flora in the northwest Himalaya. But to do it with a Van Panchayat, where the Van Panchayat is part of this project, and to restore only, say, 15 feet on either side of the pathway, so that when you're on the pathway, you have the illusion of being in a completely biodiverse environment, but you're not taking land away from farming or from forestry or from agriculture or from pastoral needs. You're only, just working with this strip. And then the idea would be that the Van Panchayat, you could train guides from the Van Panchayat to take tourists on the pathway. You have maybe tea shops and cake shops at the bottom and stuff like that. Twice I came close to being able to achieve this, to initiate this with an NGO in the Kumaon Himalayas, but it didn't work out eventually. So that again was a big disappointment. I would have loved to be able to do that. Yeah.
Yes. And that seems much easier than perhaps to do when they have something like a Van Panchayat, which, in our areas, we don't see these sort of institutions or setups.
Yeah, well, Van Panchayats were once very powerful and effective, and government has severely eroded their efficacy and their powers. So it's not as nice as it sounds. But would you like me to talk about Kishan Bagh?
Yes, please.
So in 2016, I was invited by the Jaipur Development Authority to visit Jaipur in order to look at possibilities of designing something for them. And I was skeptical, but I went. And the reason I was invited was that the CM at the time, Vasundhara Raje, had been to Nagaur and had been to Jodhpur and said, who has designed, who has made all of this? And she clearly liked what she saw. She said, call him to Jaipur, ask him to do something for us. So I was met at the airport by a white ambassador car with white toweling seats and a driver and three horticulturists from JDA. And they took me to all their parks. They spun me and said, this is Central Park. This is our best park. It's got lovely lawns. Bahut log aate hain subah. This is Prince Albert Park. This is Fanal Park. And I said, look, I'm not a designer of this kind of park. I'm not interested in lawns and, your flowering trees. So they said, by whatever we had, we've shown you. Now, what else can we show you? And I said, don't you have some little part of your city that is unraveling, degrading? And they took me somewhere and I didn't much care for that. And then they took me to this place that is a revenue area called Kishan Bagh. And Kishan Bagh was essentially made up of sand dunes that had piled up at the base of a hill, and then deep channels and ravines had been cut by water flowing down from the hill. So it looked a bit like the Chambal ravines. And my eyes lit up and I said, I'd love to restore this area. And they were completely astonished. They said, really? Seriously, yeah? And I said, yes. So I then met the commissioner in the evening and he said, look, I want to tell you something in a friendly way, that the CM has just come back from Singapore, where she's seen the gardens by the bay. She's seen all these orchids and all these wonderful tropical things, and she wants something like that. So if you can propose that you will do something like that in Kishan Bagh with computer-controlled glass, cages with humidity control and all, you will get the project. But if you have some other ideas, then I'm sorry, you're not going to. So I said, look, I'm not interested in computer-controlled, humidity-controlled glass houses. So if he doesn't like what I'm going to propose, then that's okay. He said, well, you go and think about it, but I'm just telling you as your friend that if you want a project, it has to be Gardens by the Bay Wala project. So I went to meet the CM a few weeks later with a very rough concept plan. And she said, what is it that you want to do here? She asked me a little bit about what I'd done, and I talked about Rajoda Park. And then she said, what is it that you'd like to do? And so I said, look, I've been traveling in the desert now for several years because we go out collecting seeds and we go out learning about the desert. And one of the things that we've loved to learn about is what is now a very fractured, they're just traces of original shrubland in the jungle that now disappeared. But we've searched for a name for them for a long time. People didn't understand when we would ask local people that what you call this kind of shrubland. And finally, we met a man who told us it's called a roi. And I said that we'd love to introduce the word roi into the vocabulary that people use when they think about the desert, because otherwise they dismiss the desert as a wasteland, and it's not a wasteland at all. The roi can be so beautiful and so delightful and so full of not just plants, but also lizards and snakes and skinks and animals. And she said, do you have any pictures of the roi? And I said, well, on my laptop, I have a few pictures, and I showed her maybe 5 pictures. She said, my God, these are really lovely. Think you can recreate these in Kishan Bagh? I said, well, we can try. There might be some failures. The minerals may not be the same. There'll be more rainfall here than there is out in the Thar. She said, well, do it. And the commissioner was glaring at her, saying, Are, you said to me you wanted gardens by the bay, and he's shown you 5 pictures on a computer, and you've agreed. So that's how the project started, with a lot of promise. And it was very, very, very difficult working with GDA because they had no understanding of what we were doing, no appreciation of what was going to happen. Very difficult to get paid for what you've done, even though you've got a contract. And eventually we finished the project in 2021. We were very happy with how it turned out. Jaipur City seemed to have loved it. And then we agreed to manage the park for 3 years afterwards. And again, it just proved so hard with JDA that at the end of 3 years, we said, look, I don't think we want to continue. And even though that's probably going to be the death of the park, we can't work with you anymore. So earlier this year, we put in our resignation, and they're now proceeding to ruin the park and change it. But it came out really, really interestingly. We did a lot of interpretive work there. We wanted people to understand facets of the desert. So, for example, we have a whole section where we talk about what the roi is and how other arid places in other parts of the world also have rois, and how rois are in other parts of the world are visited, are loved, are protected, are conserved. We should be doing it to our own shrublands and so on. We have a whole section on all the rocks in the desert that are made up of silica, because all of this is sandy. So we wanted silica to feature as the main star. So we have a lovely section on all the silica-bearing rocks of the desert with lots of interesting, we hope, interesting interpretation of the rock. But no, it's sad. So Kishan Bagh is, I guess will go down as another failure, although it was really lovely while it lasted.
In jungle trees, you've said, there's nothing I'd prefer to have in my field of vision except other trees and plants. And I sort of found that so unusual. What is it that affirms your kinship with trees and plants?
So, one thing that has animated everything I've done in my restoration practice was to try and imagine what a space would look like when things have grown up. People often make the mistake of overplanting and just making kind of dense woodlands that are,
Absolutely.
So for me, I'm fascinated by gardens. I find that there are very few garden spaces that I really like in India, that people don't seem to have an affinity for it. But I find it endlessly fascinating to think of. And I keep photographing wild spaces where things have just happened by chance on their own that really speak to me.
Just wanted to ask you this thing, since you've been working in this space for so long, it's such a constant that we face a threat some way or the other in the natural world, especially for people who are working in it, whether they're conservationists or trying to do a little bit of activism. There's so many ways where, this kinship is lost or is being lost. The loss of trees, the loss to the ecosystem, there is loss of agency. And many a time, and we've seen this in the recent past ourselves here in Hyderabad, there's a loss of decency as well. How do you stay optimistic? What keeps you going? What do you hold on to?
I'm not sure that I'm optimistic, but I'll tell you how I keep my head above water. One way is to hold hands with a lot of other people who do similar kind of work. I'm part of a very lovely community called the Ecological Restoration Alliance, with people spread out all over the country. Some really wonderful people, and we're now about 500 people strong. So it's quite amazing that we started with 40 3 years ago, and it's now burgeoned, ballooned to 500. But I think it's an important initiative. The central core of what we do is we share information, we share energy, we share a desire to do things and make things work. I think that we will look back, I hope, on the Ecological Restoration Alliance as being a very seminal thing in our attempt to make things change. So in that sense, I'm optimistic, but I also see a lot of signs of things degrading around me.
So one last question before we end. Any thoughts on what our listeners can do to better understand their environment? Actions they can take which will help safeguard or make better decisions to protect these biodiverse ecosystems and our natural resources? Something young people can, sort of...
Yeah, I've worked with a few young people in the last 6 or 7 years. Started out completely wet behind the ears, completely raw, and are now just completely into this business of restoration with such intelligence and such curiosity. I think the key is curiosity. If you are sufficiently curious, you will find your way of entering this field, because there are so many ways of entering it. I mean, for example, at this moment, nobody collects wildflower seeds. And I've just arrived in Goa a few days ago, passing through these amazing meadows and road verges that are just bursting with wildflowers, And I guess if somebody wants to create a wildflower meadow, they don't know where to go collect seeds from. So I'm just throwing out one random example, but there is so much to appreciate and understand, but without curiosity, it's not going to take you anywhere. So if you can allow your, what are they called, your pedipalps to wave in curiosity when you find anything natural, that's the key, I think.
Lovely. Thank you so much for spending so much time telling us so much about your life. I think the tree lovers will definitely owe you a debt of gratitude for forging this keener and more joyous relationship with trees and plants. I certainly am. And of course, the places they inhabit, that's so important. So thank you. And it's been such a pleasure talking to you, Pradip, as always. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kobita. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for listening to The Origin Story, brought to you by the Goethe-Zentrum Hyderabad and EkoGalaxy, in collaboration with Roundglass Sustain. Don't miss many more such incredible conversations coming up right here. Like, share, follow, and subscribe to the Goethe-Zentrum Hyderabad and EkoGalaxy. Thank you for your interest in our planet, biodiversity, and closely interlinked our own well-being. Thank you for listening.